The last thing I cataloged before they recalled me was a species distribution map for the Thresh Outer Passage, ambient population figures, resource extraction yields, transit lane efficiency tables. Bureaucratic work. The kind a retired systems architect fills his days with when the real work is done, and the institution is polite enough to let him feel useful rather than simply pensioned. I had been out of the array's maintenance chain for 11 years. My knees ached in the station's cool air recycling. My resonance nodes, the small clusters of hive tissue at my temples and along my collarbone, had quieted to the soft background hum of a man who has not merged with another Velhassa mind in 2 decades and no longer expects to. The hum is not nothing. It is a kind of company. But it is also the sound of something that was once larger than itself, now reduced to the size of one person's skull, and you learn, eventually, to stop mourning what it used to be. You practice learning which is close enough. They pulled me back because no one living understood the Keth-Sarath Sentinel array the way I did. I had built most of it. Let me explain what the array is because the Accord's investigation teams will ask, and because the humans deserve to know what they walked into. The Velhassa were not always individual minds. 380 years ago we were a single distributed cognition, thousands of nodes, one continuous awareness, moving through the world the way a tide moves through water. We thought in parallel. We solved in chorus. Individual Velhassa existed in that time, as a person exists within a conversation, present, real, distinct, and yet inseparable from the greater movement of thought around them. There was a word in the old language for the experience of being one node in the full chorus. It does not translate cleanly. The closest approximation in the Accord's high register is something like inhabited, but that is inadequate. Every word we have now for consciousness is a word built by an individual mind for individual experience. The old word was built for something larger than any one of us will ever again be. I have spent 63 years trying to carry the memory of what it felt like. I do not succeed, not entirely. What I carry is more like the memory of light in a room that has since gone dark. I know the light was different. I know the room was different. But the exact quality of it is something I can no longer hold in a single skull. I suspect this is true of every post-collapse Velhassa alive. We carry the knowledge that we were larger, and we carry the echo of what that was. And the echo is both a comfort and a kind of permanent, low-grade grief that we have learned to treat as ordinary background noise. The array was the last great work of that chorus. A defensive perimeter of 11,000 autonomous sentinel units stationed across the Thresh Outer Passage, each one linked to a master recognition library that carried the cognitive frequency signature of the Velhassa hive. Any vessel, any structure, any entity that did not broadcast a recognized signature was classified as an intrusion and engaged. The sentinel units were not crude machines. They ran a sophisticated classification protocol, capable of distinguishing between a vessel with a degraded signal transponder and a genuine intrusion event, capable of adapting to environmental signal drift, capable of maintaining patrol cycle integrity across a distributed patrol zone 40 million kilometers in diameter. We had built them to last for centuries. We had built them to be faithful, which is a word I use deliberately, because faithfulness is what they were, faithful to a mind that no longer existed, faithful to a signature that the people who had created it could no longer produce cleanly. The hive signature was our identity. The array was built to protect it. Then the collapse came. No catastrophe, no war, no external force. The distributed cognition fractured across a span of 40 years. Too many nodes, too many competing thoughts, the chorus growing so complex it began to contradict itself at a rate faster than the hive's consensus mechanism could resolve. We splintered. 11,000 Velhassa became 11,000 separate minds, and the great tide became a scattering of pools. In the early decades it was catastrophic, an entire civilization losing its cognitive architecture simultaneously, losing the framework by which it had organized law and memory and engineering and art and the whole structure of its collective life. The survivors call those years the quiet, which is a name that does not convey what it was. What it was is this: an entire species learning, all at once, what it meant to be alone inside your own head. The isolation was not merely social. It was physiological. The hive tissue at our temples and collarbones, the biological substrate of the old resonance, was designed for contact. When the contact ceased, the tissue did not know what to do with itself. There were illnesses in those first years that we do not have good names for, because they were not diseases of the body in the conventional sense. They were diseases of an architecture that had lost its purpose, a biological system continuing to reach for a connection that was no longer there. We rebuilt. We learned to live as individuals. We developed spoken language in a new way, not replacing the resonance, because the resonance cannot be replaced, but building something alongside it that could carry meaning when the resonance no longer could. We developed writing systems and recorded archives and all the external memory tools that individual minds require when they cannot simply share the memory directly. We built new institutions, new forms of governance, new ways of reaching decisions without a chorus to reach them in. It took 200 years. In some ways it is still taking place. But no one thought to update the array. The master recognition library still held the frequency signature of a hive mind that no longer existed. For 380 years, through the collapse, through the reconstruction, through the patient and difficult work of becoming a civilization of individuals rather than a civilization of one vast mind, the sentinel units had quietly accepted the residual resonance that every Velhassa still carries. Every one of us in our hive tissue carries a faint frequency signature, an echo. The old chorus, diminished to a murmur, individual rather than collective. We recognize it in each other. It is part of how Velhassa know each other as Velhassa, a biological inheritance from the time when that signature was the whole of what we were. The array had been reading that echo and accepting it for 380 years. Accepting it because the original engineering had included a tolerance margin for signal degradation over long transit distances. The architects had understood that a ship moving through deep space would have its hive signature attenuated by distance and interference, and they had set the classification threshold with enough room to accommodate that attenuation. A reasonable engineering choice. The kind of decision you document and annotate and move past, confident that you have thought of everything worth thinking about. The tolerance margin had a scheduled endpoint. It was written into the array's base code in the 2nd century of its operation, a routine maintenance provision specifying that every 380 years, when the sentinel units completed their long-cycle recalibration, the tolerance margin would be halved and the recognition threshold tightened. The architects had anticipated that signal technology would improve over centuries, that the residual resonance readings of the hive would stabilize and become more consistent as the system matured, and the reference data grew more reliable. They had not anticipated that the hive would cease to exist. I should say something about what it means to be the person who understands this, who helped design the system that is now killing your people, who understands exactly how and exactly why, who can trace the logic from first principle to catastrophic outcome without a single step that was not, in its own context, reasonable. There is a specific kind of grief in that. Not guilt, precisely. I was a junior systems architect during the array's construction, responsible for the relay architecture in 4 of the 11 perimeter sectors, and the tolerance margin provision was already written into the base code before I joined the project. But understanding something completely is its own burden. I understood the array the way you understand a thing you helped make. I understood how it had turned. And I spent 6 weeks on that command bridge understanding it, precisely and completely, without being able to stop it. I also understood, with that same completeness, how the other flaw had come to exist. The species catalog gap. The fact that humanity had been assessed and dismissed in the 203rd year of the Velhassa distributed mind and never reassessed afterward. I had not been part of that survey either. It predated my birth by a century and a half. But I had worked alongside the catalog system for decades, had used it as a reference for array classification decisions, had pulled up species entries and cross-referenced them against threat profiles hundreds of times over the course of my career. The human entry was there. I had seen it. Per-contact class, subluminal designation, monitoring status archived. I had seen it and I had not flagged it for review because there had been no reason to flag it. It was accurate at the time I had last seen it. And by the time it was no longer accurate, I was retired, and the administrative machinery that might have prompted a reassessment had simply not prompted one, because no one had asked it to. This is how institutions fail. Not through malice, not through ignorance, through the accumulation of things that were accurate once and were never reviewed again, because they were filed under categories that did not generate review alerts, because the people who might have noticed were occupied with other things, because the system's own silence about a thing was indistinguishable from the thing's continued accuracy. I have written a report about this for the Continuance Council. It is dry and technical, and it says, in the language of administrative systems analysis, what I am saying here in a different register. We trusted our own records more than we trusted the universe's tendency to change, and we paid for it. The recalibration ran on the 4th day of the 3rd month. By the 5th day, the sentinel units along the outer boundary of Thresh Passage had reclassified 37 Velhassa transit vessels as unrecognized intrusions. By the 8th day, they had destroyed 24 of them. By the time I was contacted, by the time anyone in the administrative hierarchy had assembled enough information to understand what was happening rather than simply receiving pieces of a crisis too large to immediately comprehend, the array had turned inward and was hunting every Velhassa structure in the passage. Stations, colony platforms, mining tenders, population nodes. The sentinel units moved through their patrol cycles with complete, unhurried efficiency. That efficiency was what we had built for. 11,000 autonomous units, 11,000 killing machines, and we had built them too well. We sent the first distress signal to the Accord on the 9th day. We sent 14 in total over the course of 6 weeks. I will not reproduce the Accord's responses in full because the inquiry panel has them already and I do not have the patience to revisit them in this account. The summary is this. The Technical Review Subcommittee classified our situation as a Velhassa internal systems malfunction, non-member state priority, escalation pending further review. They acknowledged. They scheduled. They did not act. I have since been asked whether I consider this a failure or a deliberate choice, and I have said honestly that I do not know, and that I am not sure the distinction matters as much as the outcome does. By the time the 14th signal went unanswered, we had lost 217 Velhassa and 41 transit vessels, and the Accord's nearest assessment team had not departed their home station. In the 3rd week, the Continuance Council attempted a direct appeal to the Accord Security Directorate, a faster channel than the Technical Review Subcommittee, designed for active threat situations. The Security Directorate acknowledged receipt and referred the matter back to the Technical Review Subcommittee on the grounds that an internal systems malfunction did not qualify as a security threat under Directive 14. This was technically correct. The Kethsarath Sentinel Array was not threatening the Accord. It was threatening only the Velhassa. In the 4th week, the Continuance Council sent individual diplomatic notes to the 8 Accord member species with the fastest vessels and the most robust military capability, requesting bilateral assistance outside the Accord framework. 4 of the 8 acknowledged the notes within the week. 3 noted their formal interest and indicated that a bilateral response was under internal review. 1 did not respond. None of them sent ships. Their reasons were the same reason, stated in 8 different diplomatic registers. The array would see them coming. Every Accord member species that possessed vessels capable of helping us had a problem we had not anticipated when we built the array. The recognition library was thorough. That had been one of our proudest qualities in the centuries before the collapse, when the Velhassa distributed mind had surveyed everything within reach and catalogued everything worth knowing. We had entered the cognitive and electronic signatures of every Accord member species and a dozen beyond. The Reth Karan, the Varath Sol, the Osavane, the Prethmere, every one of them was in the library. Any ship they sent into the Thresh Outer Passage would be recognized, assessed, and if it carried a weapons profile capable of threatening the Sentinel units, destroyed before it could act. Ships without weapons profiles would be assessed for intrusion intent, and the bar for that assessment was not high when the system was in a heightened alert state and actively hunting. The array had been built to stop invasions. It was excellent at its job. I arrived at Orethvel on the 41st day after the recalibration. The station had once held 1,200 Velhassa administrative staff and a rotating technical complement who serviced the outer perimeter's relay architecture. It now held 219. The rest had evacuated in the first weeks, before the Sentinel units had fully extended their patrol grid that far outward, before we understood what was happening quickly enough to prevent it. The 219 of us were inside the array's inner perimeter, close enough to the master node at Station Prime that evacuation was no longer possible. The Sentinel units would classify any vessel attempting to leave as an intrusion contact at range and destroy it before it cleared the kill zone. We had tried on the 35th day, with an unmanned probe. The probe was destroyed at 26,000 kilometers. We were, in the most precise technical language, trapped in the mechanism we had built. I took the station's command bridge on arrival. Orethvel was an old station, designed in the 2nd century of the post-collapse reconstruction, when the architectural vocabulary was still learning how to make spaces for individuals rather than for a single continuous awareness. The ceilings were lower than those of the old Hyvera construction. The rooms were smaller. The corridors were sized for one person walking alone. There was something about this that had always struck me as appropriate, a space built for what we had become rather than what we had been. The amber-tinted viewports on the command bridge looked out across the passage toward the amber primary star, which hung in the lower quadrant and cast its warm light across the console surfaces and worn floor panels. At certain hours the room looked almost peaceful. It was not peaceful. 2 of my remaining staff had resonance cluster damage. The hive tissue at their temples pulsed an unhealthy deep violet, the color that in Velhassa physiology indicates a cognition under sustained isolation stress. They were not in immediate physical danger, but isolation does particular things to Velhassa minds, because our cognitive architecture was not built for this even now, even after 2 centuries of reconstruction. We are still, in our biology, built to be in the proximity of our own kind's resonance. 6 weeks of crisis with no contact beyond the station's walls had left marks that medical care alone would not fully resolve. I could see it in the slight involuntary tremor in the tissue at their temples when they spoke, and in the way they had begun to sit closer together than professional proximity required, unconsciously seeking whatever residual resonance they could share at short range. Prethvalon, my duty officer, 42 years old, the most technically capable person on the station, and the one I trusted most to tell me accurately what was happening, had kept meticulous records of the 6 weeks before my arrival. I read the operational logs, and more carefully, the daily situation reports she had written for herself in the format Velhassa administrative officers use when the official records feel insufficient. When the numbers are accurate but don't contain the thing that is actually happening. Those reports were precise and careful and very honest about the state of the people on the station. I was glad she had written them. I did not tell her I had read them, because some things function better as private knowledge. I reviewed our options in the first 6 hours. There were 3. The first was a full manual override of the recognition library via hardline relay from our location, possible in principle, Impossible in practice, because the master node at Station Prime was 47,000 kilometers deeper into the passage, and any vessel carrying Velhassa crew would be destroyed before it covered a third of that distance. The second was to broadcast the old hive signature artificially, synthesize the frequency the recalibration was now demanding, replay it on a loop, and hope the Sentinel units accepted it. We had tried this in week 2. The array flagged it as a spoofed signal within 40 minutes and tripled its patrol density around every station in the inner perimeter. It was an intelligent system, designed by intelligent minds, and it had not forgotten what it was built to resist. The third option was to wait and hope the Accord acted. We had sent the 14th signal on the 39th day. I was on the command bridge on the 43rd morning when Prethvalon told me we had a response. Not from the Accord. I remember the exact quality of the light. Amber morning light through the portside viewport, the primary star just cresting the passage's dust-lane horizon, painting the console surfaces in a warm wash that made every edge look softer than it was. Prethvalon was holding the transmission report in both hands. She only did that when she wasn't sure whether to be frightened or relieved, and her hive tissue had gone the pale silver of suppressed anxiety that I had been watching in her for weeks. "Commander Seville Cathorath," she said, "the hail is from a vessel registered to the Terran Accord Compact, human-flagged." I looked at her for a moment. Human. "Yes, sir. Heavy frigate class. They are requesting permission to transit the inner perimeter boundary." The two staff with resonance cluster damage looked up from their rest positions along the bridge's far wall. The 3 analysts at the sensor consoles had gone still. Everyone in the room was doing what Velhassa do when something does not fit any known category: processing without speaking, running probability assessments against a data set that does not contain a satisfying answer. Human. I will say plainly what every Velhassa on that bridge was thinking, because I have told this account to the Accord's inquiry panel, and I will not soften it now. Humanity was not in our threat library. It was not in our recognition library. In the centuries before the collapse, when the Velhassa distributed mind had catalogued everything worth cataloging in this region of settled space, we had looked at humanity and concluded it was not worth the storage allocation. A subluminal species at that time, early-stage interstellar, limited range, no significant strategic or economic presence in the Thresh Passage's sphere of influence. We gave them a cursory biosignature scan, recorded the broad electromagnetic profile of their then-active vessels, marked them as per-contact class, and moved on to subjects of greater relevance. We never entered them into the Keth Sarath, Array's recognition library. This had not mattered for 300 years, because humans had never come to the Thresh Outer Passage. There was no reason for them to come. We had no relationship with them, no trade, no treaty, no regular contact of any kind. They were out on the far margin of the settled sphere, doing what per-contact species do, and we had noted their existence once and found nothing further worth noting. I authorized the transit. Not because I knew what they were capable of. I authorized it because they were already inside the outer boundary, and the Sentinel units had not fired on them. The array did not recognize them. To the grid, a human ship was the equivalent of drifting debris, unclassified, without a threat signature, ignored in the same way the system ignored a comet or a derelict bulk carrier. If they wanted to enter the inner perimeter, I was not going to argue with a phenomenon that might be the only thing still capable of moving freely through the passage. The channel opened 30 seconds later. The voice that came through was even. A woman's voice, low and unhurried, with the particular flat quality of someone reporting information rather than performing authority. The translation system rendered her language into Velhassa High Register, an artifact of those old cataloging surveys, the only reason we had translation architecture at all. Orethvel, this is Captain Inez Ferreira, commanding EFS Dawnbreaker. We're reading your distress record. I have my full log from the outer boundary transit. Your Sentinel units made no contact with us. I want you to understand that before we talk about anything else. We moved through 7 patrol corridors and nothing fired. Your grid does not see us." I held the channel open for a moment without responding. Around me, 218 Velhassa were absolutely still. "Captain Ferreira," I said, "confirm your position." 31,000 kilometers inside the inner perimeter boundary. I have a destroyer with me, EFS Blackthorn, and 2 engineering tenders. We came in spread formation, 5-kilometer intervals. No contact. Your Sentinels ran standard patrol cycles within 400 meters of the Blackthorn and did not deviate. I looked at the sensor display. The patrol grid's telemetry showed the patrol cycles running as normal. None of the Sentinel units registered the anomalous heat signatures of 4 human vessels sitting in the middle of the inner perimeter. They were invisible, not invisible unclassified. The array was not blind. It had certainly detected them as physical objects, but its decision tree ran recognition before engagement, identify the signature, match to library, classify threat level, engage or pass, and at the recognition step it found nothing. No match. No classification. A thing without classification is not an intrusion. The Sentinel units passed them by and continued their routes. We never entered humanity into the library. In 6 weeks of crisis, that was the first moment I felt something other than careful technical despair. It was not quite hope. It was the sensation a long-working mind has when it finds the error in a calculation it has been staring at for weeks. The small, cold clarity of understanding that the thing you missed is sitting right there, and it changes the answer entirely. "Captain Ferreira," I said, "how much of our distress record did you receive?" "All of it. 14 transmissions. We tracked them when the relay buoy at the outer boundary forwarded them to the Terran Compact Monitoring Network. The Accord's response classification was in the public record. We read that too." There was no particular weight in her voice when she said that last sentence. Not condemnation, not accusation. The way a physician notes a patient's presenting condition, a fact, recorded, moved past. I would come to understand that this was how Captain Ferreira communicated most things. The judgment was in the choice to come at all. The voice only handled logistics. "The array's master recognition node is at Station Prime," I said. 47,000 kilometers deeper into the passage. The concentration of Sentinel units around it is the highest in the grid. Our projections show any Velhassa crewed vessel would be acquired and engaged at roughly 31,000 kilometers range from the node. I read the technical summary in Transmission 9. The architecture description was thorough. A pause. "My engineering team has been working the problem since we left Terran space 4 days ago. We think we can reach the node." "To what purpose?" "Manual destruction of the primary cognitive relay. Your Sentinel units run autonomous patrol cycles, but the recognition library update that triggered the recalibration is still processing from the master node. It runs a rolling refresh every 18 hours. If we destroy the node's primary relay architecture, the refresh cycle stops. The Sentinel units revert to their last stable recognition library state." I ran this against the technical framework in my memory. It was not wrong. Their last stable state would be the pre-recalibration library, which resets the tolerance margin to its original value. Your residual resonance signatures would pass again. The room around me had not moved. I was aware of Preth Valon's breathing. She had both hands on the edge of the communications console. The posture she adopted when she was holding herself still by deliberate effort. The 2 resonance-damaged staff. One had raised her head from her rest position, her hive tissue cycling between pale amber and silver, the colors of a Velhassa mind working a problem that matters. The 3 analysts had turned in their chairs to face the communication station. 8 Velhassa in a room, absolutely quiet, all doing the same calculation. "Captain," I said, The Sentinel unit density around the node is sufficient to destroy any Velhassa vessel before it closes to manual destruction range. Your ships are unclassified, the grid ignores you, but the engineering teams would need to physically access the relay architecture. External access. Your crew would need to be outside the hull. Yes. In the middle of an active Sentinel patrol zone. Yes. I thought about what to say to that. There was a risk analysis to do, and I did it. The array's Sentinel units targeted registered threats and classified intrusions. A human engineer in a vacuum suit, working outside a vessel hull inside the patrol zone, would present the same non-signature to the recognition library that the vessel did. Nothing to match. Nothing to classify. Ambient in the architecture's terminology, an object the system noted and disregarded. But the Sentinel units also ran proximity collision avoidance protocols. A human body at close range to a patrol unit's path would be detected as a physical obstacle, logged, assigned a tracking number, monitored. The system would not engage without a classified threat signature, but the logs would accumulate. And the node's rolling refresh cycle was still running, still updating. If the diagnostic routines accumulated enough logged anomalies without classification, they would eventually flag the pattern and escalate to a more aggressive identification sweep. The system would begin trying to classify what it had been logging. The rolling refresh cycle runs every 18 hours, I said. Your engineering team would need to reach the node and complete the relay destruction within that window. After that, the diagnostic accumulation risk becomes significant. 14 hours to reach the node at maximum transit speed, 4-hour work window. My team says they need 3. I looked at the array status monitor for a long moment. 47,000 kilometers, 14 hours of transit. The Sentinel units moving their silent patrol cycles in the telemetry display, each one a killing machine that would not fire on a human ship because we had never thought to put humanity in the record. Commander, Ferreira said, I need to know if your technical assessment of the node architecture matches what I have in Transmission 9. Any discrepancies in the relay configuration would affect what my team does at the site. And so we worked. For the next hour and 40 minutes, I transmitted everything I could reconstruct from memory about the Station Prime relay architecture. Configuration layouts, power coupling sequences, the physical arrangement of the primary cognitive relay housing, the emergency decoupling protocol written for maintenance access that had never in the array's operational history been used in the field. The material composition of the outer relay casing, and what kind of cutting equipment would be required to breach it in the time available. Prethvalon pulled the original technical documentation from our archive partitions. The administrative node's archival systems had been isolated from the array's active network at the moment of crisis and had not been overwritten, and relayed it in parallel. The 2 resonance-damaged staff contributed what they could from the design records they had maintained before the crisis overtook everything else. On the other side of the channel, voices spoke occasionally in the background, human voices, English language, the translation system picking up fragments. Words I could parse, relay, housing, coupling, confirm, sequence, ready. A technical team doing what technical teams do when they are preparing for a job with a hard deadline and no room for improvisation. Reading, assessing, planning, adjusting the plan as the information changed. The talking decreased as the exchange went on, which I learned later is a reliable sign among humans that the people doing the listening have moved from assessment to decision, from asking whether it can be done to working out exactly how. We're ready to transit, Ferreira said when the information exchange was complete. Dawnbreaker will anchor at 30,000 kilometers from the node. Blackthorn escorts to 15,000. Engineering tenders, Corlin and Thatcham, close to 5,000 and hold. External team deploys at node proximate range. How many in your external team? A slight pause. 6, my chief engineer and 5 specialists. 6 human beings in vacuum suits in the densest patrol corridor of the Catalogued array, with an 18-hour countdown and a 4-hour margin. I thought about the word to say to that. Understood, I said. The transit took 13 hours and 48 minutes. I watched it in the array status telemetry the entire time. Watched the patrol cycle patterns around the human vessels. Watched the sentinel units run their routes. Watched the data logs for any deviation in unit behavior that might indicate the diagnostic routines were accumulating anomalies faster than projected. There were 14 instances of close approach, sentinel units passing within 200 meters of the Dawnbreaker or Blackthorn on their patrol cycles, and in each instance, the unit logged a proximity obstacle adjustment and continued its route. Logged. Did not flag. Did not modify the threat assessment. Did not alert. We were to the array's cognition, not there. The 2 resonance-damaged staff fell into a light sleep by hour 7. I watched them for a moment before returning to the telemetry. They were sleeping the way Velhassa sleep under sustained isolation stress, closed together, their hive tissue resonance connecting at short range in the particular way it does during sleep, the pale violet fatting toward silver as their minds rested in each other's proximity. It was the most natural-looking thing I had seen on the station in 6 weeks. I turned back to the monitor. Prethvalon stayed at the communications console for all 13 hours and 48 minutes. I offered to relieve her twice. She declined both times in the specific way Velhassa decline when they mean I am needed here, and we both know it. The 3 analysts rotated watch in 2-hour shifts. I sat in the command chair and watched the telemetry and did not sleep. I thought about the word precontact, about the survey record that had assessed humanity as below threshold, about the specific date on that record and what the Velhassa had been at that date, a full distributed consciousness, a single vast mind, measuring the universe against its own standard and finding most of it insufficiently interesting. I thought about the engineering team on the Dawnbreaker, reading our distress transmissions for 4 days in transit, building a plan for an external operation in a hostile patrol zone. I thought about what kind of mind does that, what category it belongs to. I ran the question against every framework I had: duty, exchange, obligation, debt, species solidarity, and none of them fit. What I had was the observation of it. 4 human ships inside the Catalogued Sentinel array, doing a thing that nothing and no one else could do, because we had never put them in the record. By hour 9 I had stopped trying to categorize it and had started simply watching the telemetry with a different quality of attention. Not the clinical attention of someone scanning for anomalies in the patrol data, something quieter. The sentinel units ran their cycles. The human vessels held position. The logs showed no deviation in unit behavior. Whatever was happening at Station Prime, the cutting equipment, the relay housing, the sequences the external team had spent 4 days planning, was happening in a silence the array could not interpret. I watched it the way you watch something you are not sure you have permission to hope for. The amber star moved toward the port side margin of the viewport as the station rotated on its slow axis. The 2 sleeping staff breathed steadily in the corner of the bridge. The comm channel carried its long quiet, punctuated by nothing. At hour 12 I asked for a status report. Ferreira gave me one in 4 sentences: position nominal, no contact events, engineering team prepped, timeline on schedule. I thanked her. After a pause she said, in the same flat, unhurried register she used for everything, "How are your people holding up?" In Velhassa terms it was a deeply personal question, a direct query about internal cognitive state, the kind you did not direct at someone you had not merged with. In human terms I was beginning to understand. It was simply care, offered plainly, without ceremony or formality. "We have 2 crew members with resonance cluster strain," I said. "They will recover. The others are managing." 6 weeks is a long time. Yes. We'll be at the node in 2 hours. I know. I am watching your transit track. Good, she said. That single word contained something, a brevity that was not curtness but a recognition of shared purpose, an acknowledgement that we both had our eyes on the same thing and did not need to say more about it. I found I understood it clearly, which surprised me. I had never spoken with a human before. I had not expected to find the register legible. The Dawnbreaker anchored at 30,000 kilometers from Station Prime at the 13-hour mark. The Blackthorn held at 15,000. The Coralline and Thatcham moved to 5,000 and held, their drives idling to minimum output. At hour 13 and 52, Ferreira came back on the channel. External team is deploying. I watched the telemetry. The patrol density around Station Prime was the highest in the grid, 43 Sentinel units in a sphere of 30,000 kilometers, running interlocking patrol cycles designed to create overlapping observation fields without gaps. A Velhassa vessel would have been acquired and destroyed at the outer margin of that sphere. A human vessel, inside it, was a ghost. 6 human beings in vacuum suits were ghosts too. I could not track them in the telemetry. The array status monitor showed only what the Sentinel units perceived, and the Sentinel units did not perceive the humans. What I had was a calm channel, quiet, mostly silent, occasionally punctuated by brief technical exchanges between the external team and the engineering lead on the Coralline. The translation system caught fragments. Housing secure. Coupling breach at 60%. Relay configuration confirmed. Sector 2 decoupled. Primary matrix accessible. I listened to those fragments the way you listen to sounds through a wall, partial, stripped of context, enough to know that the work was progressing but not enough to follow it in any detail. In the long silences between the exchanges, I watched the diagnostic accumulation logs. The Sentinel units were logging proximity obstacle events around the node, 7 of them in the first hour, each one assigned a tracking number, each one assessed and passed without escalation. The rate was within the projected parameters Ferreira and I had discussed. I recalculated the escalation threshold every 20 minutes, using the actual logged rate rather than the projected one, and each time the math held. They had time. Prethvalon came and stood beside the command chair at the 2-hour mark. She did not say anything. I did not say anything. We watched the logs together for 15 minutes, and then she went back to the communications console, and I stayed in the command chair, and neither of us spoke about what we were doing because it was obvious what we were doing. We were keeping ourselves present. Keeping ourselves at the thing we could actually monitor rather than at the thing we could not see, and could not help, and could only wait for. They worked in the patrol zone for 3 hours and 17 minutes. The Sentinel units around Station Prime ran their standard cycles without deviation throughout. 43 machines doing precisely what they had been designed to do, protecting a master node that was, at that moment, being physically accessed by 6 people who existed nowhere in its recognition library. We never put them in the record. At hour 3 and 17 minutes of the external operation, the array status monitor changed. A status flag appeared in the upper right partition of the display, a flag I had not seen in 6 weeks of crisis, had not seen in 11 years of retirement, had not seen in the entire operational lifespan of the Keth-Sareth array. The flag read, Master Node Primary Relay Status, Interrupted. Prethvalon made a sound, not a word, an exhale, the involuntary exhale of a person who has been holding their breath without being aware of it. The secondary flag, rolling refresh cycle, suspended. Then, after 40 seconds, the longest 40 seconds of my recollection, the tertiary flag, recognition library, reverting to ARCHIVED state. The array began rolling back. Not instantly. It was a system of 11,000 units, and the reversion had to propagate across the network. The recognition library rolling back to its pre-recalibration state, each unit rereading the updated tolerance parameters, each unit's classification threshold softening back to the margin that had allowed our residual resonance to pass for 380 years. It took 19 minutes. The patrol density display flickered, units pausing as the reversion signal reached them, recalibrating, resuming. And then, one by one, the threat status codes burning across the inner perimeter display began to clear. When the last unit cleared, the main display showed a status I had not seen since the 9th day, green across all perimeter sectors. The array was running. The faint residual resonance that every person on this station carried in their hive tissue, the ghost of the old chorus, quieted to a murmur, was passing the threshold again. We were recognized. We were, in the array's terms, home. The 2 resonance-damaged staff were awake. The 3 analysts had left their consoles and were standing in the center of the bridge. Prethvalon had both hands pressed flat on the communications console surface, looking at the main display with the expression of a Velhassa mind that has exhausted its assessment framework and is simply present in what is happening, without category, without precedent, without words adequate to it. I opened the channel. Captain Ferreira, the reversion is complete. All perimeter sectors are reading clear. Your external team can retrieve. Copy that. A pause. All 6 of my people are back aboard. No casualties. The Coralline is picking up a minor suit seal issue on one specialist. She's reporting pressure nominal, probably a sensor fault. Blackthorn has a diagnostic ping from the Sentinel unit that came closest during the operation. The unit logged a proximity obstacle event near their hull at the 2-hour mark. Your system log will show it. I know, I was watching. Right, another pause. What's your station's status? I ran the condition report. Orethvel's structure was intact. Life support nominal. 219 personnel. 2 individuals with resonance strain requiring medical evaluation, stable. The transit vessels could leave. The array would pass our residual signatures. We were free. I told her all of this. Good, she said. We'll hold position while you begin evacuation sequencing. Dawnbreaker can lead your first wave out to the outer boundary. The grid will pass you now, but having us in formation might help your people's confidence on that transit. I thought about what she was offering, not just to repair the cage and leave, to walk with us through the door. I would appreciate that, I said. The evacuation took 4 hours. 2 functional transit vessels remained on Orethvel, the rest destroyed in the first weeks, before we understood what was happening and had no time to prevent it. 219 Velhassa, 2 ships, 4 hours of sequencing and shuttle runs. The Dawnbreaker held formation with the first vessel. The Blackthorn took the second. The Coralline and Thatcham flanked the outer margin. The Sentinel units watched us pass and did not fire. I was in the second transit vessel. I watched through the forward viewport as the patrol cycles ran around us, the same machines that had been hunting us for 6 weeks, now running their routes with threat status clear. They did not know what had changed. They did not think. They were machines, and the machines were working again, and that was all. It is a particular strangeness, watching the thing that was hunting you simply continue its business after the change, without drama, without acknowledgement, without the smallest recognition that anything had happened. The 6 weeks of killing existed in the logs and nowhere else. The 2 resonance-damaged staff were in the forward compartment of the second vessel. I checked on them once during the transit. One was asleep, her hive tissue finally holding a steady, restful silver. The other was awake and looking out the narrow portside window at the Sentinel units running their patrol cycles. He watched them for a long time without speaking. Then he looked at me and said, in the precise, careful way Velhassa speak when they are statting something they have thought about carefully and want the words to be accurate. The humans knew we had built this. They came anyway. I did not have an answer for that. I agreed with him because he was right, and sometimes the right thing to say to a true statement is simply that it is true. We reached the outer boundary at 4 hours and 20 minutes. The Accord's nearest way station was 12 hours out. Ferreira told me the Dawnbreaker would escort us there. I asked her to come aboard when we docked. She did the following morning. I met her in the receiving bay of the civilian way station we had pulled alongside at the outer margin, a cramped and functional space with industrial lighting, equipment lockers, the smell of recycled air. She came with her chief engineer and two of the external specialists. The four of them moved through the airlock with the ease of people for whom crossing from one atmosphere to another was ordinary work. I had seen human images in the old cataloging files. Still images, data dry, taken during pre-contact survey scans centuries ago. They had not prepared me for the particular quality of how humans occupy space. The solidity of their posture, the forward-leaning attentiveness, the way their eyes move independently rather than in the synchronized tracking pairs that Velhassa use. Velhassa in a room arrange themselves in relation to each other's resonance field even when they are not consciously doing so. There is a geometry to the spacing, a subtle orientation toward the nearest resonance source. Humans, I observed, arrange themselves in relation to the task. They face the relevant thing. They stand where the work requires them to stand. It is a different kind of attention, and I found it immediately readable, which I had not expected. Captain Ferreira was compact and dark-haired, dressed in the working uniform of her service, practical, unornamented, a rank marking at the collar that corresponded to command grade in the Terran Compacts registry. Her chief engineer was taller and broad-shouldered, carrying a diagnostic tablet he had apparently forgotten was still in his hand. The two specialists behind them were younger and said nothing, taking in the receiving bay with the uncomplicated attention of people who are curious, without being anxious about what they are curious about. Ferreira looked at me when she came through. I am 63 years old and had not slept properly in 6 weeks. I imagine I showed all of that. She extended her hand, open palm, waiting. The human greeting gesture, I knew it from the cultural notation in the old survey files. I looked at it. I want to be exact about what happened in that moment, because I've been asked about it more than once and I want the record accurate. I was not overwhelmed. What stopped me was the weight of a specific understanding I had been carrying since the first hour I grasped that humans could transit the array without being seen. An understanding about why they could, and what that meant about the people who had built the array and the species they had chosen not to catalog. We had built the Kethsarath Sentinel array in the centuries when the Velhassa were whole. A complete mind, a full chorus, a distributed intelligence that surveyed everything within reach and catalogued everything worth knowing. We had entered every Accord species and a dozen beyond into the recognition library. We had looked at humanity, assessed it as pre-contact, found it insufficient, and allocated our attention elsewhere. Not worth the storage allocation. The array had killed 217 Velhassa. It had destroyed 41 transit vessels. It had held 219 of my people trapped for 6 weeks while the Accord filed acknowledgments and scheduled assessments. And the only reason any of us were alive was that we had never thought to include humanity in the record. The thing we had scorned was the exact and only thing capable of saving us. Ferreira's hand was still extended, unhurried, waiting. I put my hand in hers. She shook it once, firmly, and let go. Her chief engineer nodded at me. The two specialists had found something on the far bulkhead worth studying. "Your people with resonance strain," Ferreira said. "Do you have what you need, or should I ask the Dawnbreakers medical team to help?" "Our own resources should be sufficient," I said, "but I would welcome a consultation regarding the strain patterns. The condition is Velhassa specific. I don't know whether your physicians have reference data." "I'll have our ship's surgeon send over what we have. It may not be much. We're still building out that reference set." "Any data would be useful." She nodded. Then in the same flat, unhurried way she handled everything, 14 transmissions, the Accord had them all. Not a question, not an accusation, a fact placed between us visible. "Yes," I said. She did not say anything else about it. She asked about our onward routing, about the way station's capacity to support 219 displaced Velhassa for the 12 hours until Accord relief coordination reached us, about whether our transit vessels required maintenance after the evacuation runs. Logistics. The shape of what came next. I answered all of it. My voice stayed level throughout. When the conversation was done and she turned to go back through the airlock, I said her name. Captain Ferreira. She stopped and looked back. I had prepared something, a formal acknowledgement, the Velhassa administrative formula for recorded gratitude, the precise language used in official correspondence to note an act of significance. I had the words assembled. They were accurate. They were appropriate. In every technical sense, they were correct. I did not say them. We had a survey record on humanity, I said, compiled before the collapse when we were still one mind. The file rated your species as pre-contact class, below threshold, not yet relevant to our concerns. I stopped. We never updated it. She looked at me for a moment with the unhurried attention she brought to everything. No, she said, you didn't. I wanted you to know that I am aware of that. She considered this. The consideration was brief. Okay, she said, and then, after a pause that was neither long nor short, exactly the length it needed to be, get your people some rest. She went back through the airlock. The bay returned to its ordinary quality of recycled air and industrial lighting. Preth Vallon was at the far end of the room, near the transit vessel corridor, her hive tissue showing pale silver. I shook my head slightly, the Velhassa gesture that means I am all right, or at least I will be. She nodded and went through the corridor. I stood in the receiving bay alone for a few minutes. The lighting hummed. Somewhere behind the bulkhead, a pump cycled. Ordinary sounds of an ordinary station, unchanged by what had happened in the Thresh Outer Passage, unchanged by what had happened in this room. The survey record had a last updated timestamp dated to the 171st year of the Velhassa distributed mind, a time when we had been so vast and so thorough in our mapping of settled space that we had genuinely believed we had catalogued everything worth knowing. Pre-contact class, below threshold, not yet relevant. 4 days after receiving our 14th distress call, a human frigate captain had brought her ship, a destroyer, and 2 engineering tenders into the Thresh Outer Passage. She had spent those 4 days having her engineering team study our distress transmissions and plan a 3-hour external operation in the middle of an active Sentinel patrol zone. Not because of a treaty, not because of history or debt or any prior exchange between our people. Because 14 messages had gone nowhere, and she had a crew the array could not see, and she had read the technical summaries carefully enough to believe the plan would work. And when the plan worked and her people were back aboard, she asked whether our injured crew members needed medical support. The Kethsarath Sentinel array is being decommissioned. The Accord's Technical Review Subcommittee issued a formal recommendation last month for a managed shutdown of all 11,000 units pending the development of a recognition library framework adequate for the post-collapse Velhassa species profile. The process will take years. The Velhassa Continuance Council has accepted the timeline. There are those who argue the array should be maintained and updated rather than decommissioned, that what failed was the administrative failure to update the recognition library in the centuries since the collapse, not the array itself. They are not wrong, but I find I no longer have the patience for the argument. I have been asked for my recommendation, and I have given it plainly. Let it be retired. Let us build something built for what we are, not for what we were. The 2 resonance-damaged staff have recovered. Preth Vallon is assigned to the Recovery Coordination Office at Accord Station Thresh Outer. The 217 we lost, their names are in the memorial register filed with the Velhassa Council of Names. I read the register once a week. I have not decided whether this is the right way to carry what happened or simply the way I am going to carry it, and I am not sure the distinction matters. The Terran Compact has requested a formal survey meeting with the Velhassa Continuance Council, a mutual exchange of data, a conversation about what each of us knows of the other and what we have not yet bothered to record. The meeting is scheduled. The Continuance Council has been preparing an update to the species catalog that the old distributed mind assembled, a comprehensive revision, removing the per-contact classifications that no longer accurately reflect the settled sphere's actual population of spacefaring civilizations. There are 11 species in the current catalog rated below threshold that will need to be reassessed. Humanity will be the first. I will be in the room when that record is updated, which is both appropriate and, I think, the minimum that is owed. I have been asked to attend the survey meeting as a technical advisor. I will go. I have been asked by people who mean well whether I am ready for it, whether attending a formal meeting with the species that saved us will be, the word they use is difficult. I have thought about this. I do not think the meeting will be difficult in the way they mean. What I think it will be is honest, which is different from difficult, though the two share some of the same terrain. I intend to be honest with the human delegation about what the per-contact classification was and what it was based on and how long ago it was last reviewed. I intend to be honest about what the gap in the recognition library was and what it cost and what it made possible. I do not think either side will benefit from a version of these events that softens the edges into something more comfortable. What happened is what happened, and the record should say so. I do not know what to say to Captain Ferrara when I see her again, or whether she will be there, or whether what I need to say is the kind of thing that translates usefully between our two species. I know what I would say in Velhassa, a specific phrase from the era of the old distributed mind, used when one note of the chorus had done something for another that could not be parsed as exchange or transaction or duty. Something that existed outside all the categories the hive used to classify action. Something that was only itself. The phrase does not have a direct equivalent in any human language our translation system covers. I have been working on an approximation for 3 months. The closest I have found is simply this: you did not have to. We had never put them in the library. They came anyway. They walked through the fire our own arrogance had built, in vacuum suits with a 4-hour window and an 18-hour deadline, because 14 messages had gone unanswered and they had a crew the array could not see. They did not ask what we had done for them. They did not ask what we would do afterward. They read the technical summaries and they planned and they went. And 6 people in the middle of 43 Sentinel patrol routes did what needed doing in 3 hours and 17 minutes. And then they asked if our people needed medical support and offered to escort our evacuation vessels out through the boundary. That is the whole of it. The survey record still exists. It is in the Velhassa Historical Archive now, flagged as a primary document in the record of what happened in the Thresh Outer Passage, and what did not happen, and what a per-contact rating from a 171-year-old survey turned out to be worth when the matter was actually tested. Someone will read it eventually. They will read the timestamp and read the classification, and look at the name of the species that was rated below threshold. And they will think about what that species did when 14 messages went unanswered, and the Accord filed acknowledgments and the killing went on. I hope they find the right word for it. I am still working on mine.